Somewhere in the rural parishes of central Georgia, an old plantation house sits like a closed wound in the historical record. Rosewood Hall, an estate whose ledgers from 1008, 147 to 1008, 151 show strange, deliberate gaps, and whose early investigation files were sealed for decades and physically mutilated. When finally unbound, a tactile kind of erasure that hints at a scandal people worked hard to bury. The facts that survive are stark and heartbreaking. Rosewood Hall was built in 1008, 134 by Thomas Harwell using family shipping profits and the labor of dozens of enslaved people. The main house rose 3 stories with Doric columns and a cultivated facade of gentility. Behind it, the practical structures that made the plantation run: the kitchen house, the overseer's cottage, the field quarters arranged a small social kingdom with its own rules and rigid hierarchies. Into this world came Catherine Beaumont, a 23-year-old bride from Charleston whose family was comfortably near wealth but in need of the social and economic security a well-arranged marriage could afford. Thomas Harwell was older, recently widowed, and wealthy. The marriage made sense on paper. What no one had considered was how Catherine, raised amid the bustle and kin networks of Charleston, would fare in the brutal isolation of a large plantation house, where companionship was a regulated commodity, and most people around her were forbidden by law and custom to recognize her as anything other than mistress. Deline, sometimes recorded as Delphine in fragmentary papers and oral memory, had been born at Rosewood Hall and trained in household arts by her mother, Celia, who had been the plantation's head cook until her death. Deline was accomplished in every way that mattered in the domestic economy. She could butcher and preserve, bake and prepare elaborate dishes, and manage the younger kitchen workers with practiced authority. Because her skills were so valuable, Thomas Harwell had kept her and her younger brother Marcus on the estate when other families' members were sold. Within the plantation's violent calculus, she was property whose utility outweighed the short-term profit of sale. But that cold accounting also produced for Deline a degree of relative autonomy. The kitchen house, set a short walk from the main residence and connected only by a covered passage, became a domain where she supervised, worked long hours, and moved in a daily rhythm that was hers alone, observed only at a distance by the house's formalities. Catherine's first months at Rosewood Hall followed the predictable pattern of genteel ennui and social duty. She wrote to sisters, practiced needlework, oversaw servants in the hesitant, performative way a new planter's wife was expected to do, and suffered the long silences that plantation life imposed. Thomas traveled often for business, leaving Catherine alone in the great, quiet rooms, watched over by servants who could never truly meet her as an equal because the law and custom forbade it. Loneliness shifted from an abstract melancholy into a physical ache, and by late summer Catherine found herself more and more often drawn to the heat and activity of the kitchen house. At first, she blamed efficiency. Learning household management justified her visits. But the kitchen offered warmth, motion, and a human presence that the house's polished surfaces could not provide. Deline moved through the space with a confidence Catherine had never encountered in the formal circles of Charleston. The kitchen smelled of bread and simmering stews. It registered living rhythms rather than the careful stillness of her room designed to display status. Their first conversation that broke the rigid codes of mistress and servant happened quietly around a work table as Catherine asked whether Deline had learned to cook from her mother. The question was small but dangerous. It acknowledged lineage and personhood. Deline replied with a guarded honesty, yes. Her mother taught her everything, and when Catherine asked if she missed her, a guarded intimacy was born. That exchange should have been the limit of curiosity, a human moment left inside the carefully policed boundaries of plantation hierarchy. Instead, it became the hinge on which a deeper connection turned. Catherine returned with needlework, sitting near the fire while Deline worked. The two traded small confidences, at first books, recipes, the rhythms of the plantation, and then, over months, The conversation deepened into admitted loneliness, fears, and a shared recognition that the social world around them had carved out roles that left both women starved for the kind of care they found in each other's presence. For Deline, the stakes were exponentially higher. She had learned by experience and necessity that any breach of prescribed distance could mean sale, punishment, or death. She had no legal recourse, no backing beyond the thin protection her usefulness could sometimes provide. For Catherine, raised to expect marriage and inheritance to structure a life that required little moral reckoning, the discovery that she could be seen and known by an enslaved woman cracked an intellectual and emotional certainty she had always been taught to hold, namely, that there could be no genuine reciprocity across the color line. Both women discovered how much of their daily identities had been constructed to sustain a system that depended on pretending vital human truths did not exist. Over the following months, acts that might seem small in another context lingering conversation. A hand brushed against a shoulder, a shared laugh accumulated into intimacy. They read aloud to one another and exchanged practical skills, Catherine bringing books and stories from Charleston, Deline teaching the mechanics of making bread and of living with one's hands. The domestic roles that had defined them began, in those private moments, to dissolve into a relation neither society could sanction nor they could safely name. What they built was fragile and perilous, a human bond fashioned in the margins of a system designed to prevent precisely such recognition. The winter of 1848 arrived early at Rosewood Hall, settling over the plantation like a stern reminder that time could slow without granting mercy. The cold transformed ordinary routines into burdens. The kitchen fires had to be fed before dawn, livestock needed constant tending, and the fields took on a stark quietness that made even the enslaved quarters seem muffled. Inside the main house, however, Catherine found that the change in season intensified the isolation she already felt. The social visits she might have expected as a planter's wife dwindled with each passing week, and Thomas's business trips grew longer, leaving her alone in a house that echoed every footstep. The silence no longer simply filled the rooms. It pressed around her, demanding she notice how profoundly alone she was in her marriage. During these weeks, her visits to the kitchen house evolved from tentative intrusions to daily rituals. The warmth of the hearth made the space feel alive, pulsing with the sound of chopping vegetables, simmering pots, and the soft chatter among the younger workers. Yet it was Deline who drew Catherine most consistently. Deline's calm, practiced movements in the kitchen showed a mastery acquired through years of necessity, but there was also a quiet resilience in her that Catherine recognized only with growing clarity. Where Catherine's life had been shaped by expectation and propriety, Deline's had been shaped by survival, and within that survival, a strength that Catherine found both admirable and humbling. As winter deepened, so did their conversations. What began as small talk about recipes or household details gradually shifted into exchanges that revealed layers beneath their roles. Catherine spoke of her girlhood in Charleston, where the ocean winds had always carried the promise of bustling streets and familiar faces. She confessed how marriage had transported her into a world where she played a part she had never chosen for herself. Deline, cautious but growing to trust Catherine's sincerity, shared fragments of her own past memories of her mother's singing, her brother Marcus's stubborn streak, and the nights when the kitchen house became a refuge, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. The dynamic between them changed subtly but unmistakably. Catherine began staying after the day's meals were prepared, helping Deline knead dough or peel vegetables. This was not a task a planter's wife was expected to perform. It was an unspoken rebellion against the etiquette that governed her. Each shared activity dissolved the invisible lines that society insisted must remain unbroken. Their hands brushed more often now, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. When Catherine laughed, the sound felt real for the first time in months, unguarded by the layers of performance she wore in the main house. But with the growing closeness came a growing fear especially for Deline. Every moment of warmth between them existed under the shadow of a system designed to punish such intimacies with brutal efficiency. Deline knew that an enslaved woman's life could be uprooted in a single instant based on suspicion alone. She reminded herself of this constantly, even when Catherine's presence made her forget, even for a breath, that the world outside the kitchen walls was governed by violence. Catherine, for her part, began to confront truths she had long learned to ignore. She saw how the plantation operated not as a genteel estate, but as a machine powered by coerced labor, enforced silence, and institutionalized fear. She noticed the way Deline lowered her eyes when Thomas entered the kitchen, the way Marcus tensed around the overseer, the way every enslaved person measured their words. Catherine struggled with this knowledge. She was complicit, part of a system she had inherited through marriage, yet she found herself increasingly unable to turn away from the humanity of the people she lived alongside. The intensity of their conversations sometimes scared Catherine. She had never spoken so openly to anyone, not her sisters, not her husband, not the women in Charleston who spent afternoons gossiping over tea. And she had certainly never imagined that the person who understood her most deeply would be someone she had been taught to view as inferior. The contradiction shook her, but even as she grappled with that internal conflict, she could not bring herself to sever the connection. One night, after an unusually long evening preparing preserves for the winter, Catherine lingered in the kitchen house long after the others had retired. Deline sat beside her near the fire, the room quiet except for the gentle crackle of burning wood. In that soft glow, their faces illuminated and shadows dancing across the walls, Catherine felt a pull she could not deny. She confided that she dreaded Thomas's return, not because he was cruel, but because his presence reinstated every barrier their friendship had begun to dissolve. Deline listened, hands folded tightly in her lap, torn between empathy and the instinct to protect herself. In that moment, without touching, without naming anything, they crossed into a territory that defied the rules of their world. The silence between them brimmed with understanding, a recognition that whatever existed now was more than companionship and far more dangerous than either was ready to admit. The arrival of early spring at Rosewood Hall brought a slow thaw to the landscape, but inside the plantation's social world, nothing truly softened. The trees budded, the fields regained color, and the air grew warmer, yet the oppressive structures that governed daily life remained unchanged. Catherine felt this contrast more acutely than ever. The world outside seemed to exhale, while her own life remained tight, calculated, and suffocating. Thomas returned from his business travels with renewed vigor, inspecting accounts, meeting with overseers, and re-establishing the routines that always made the house feel more rigid. His presence was not violent nor outwardly cruel, but it carried with it the unspoken weight of authority, a reminder that everything, including Catherine herself, existed within boundaries he controlled. With Thomas home, Catherine's visits to the kitchen house became less frequent, but distance only deepened her longing for the warmth, honesty, and quiet understanding she found in Deline's company. The main house resumed its polished stillness, and conversations became formal again. At dinners, Catherine listened to Thomas discuss crop yields, trade routes, cotton brokers, and the efficiency of the labor force, words that felt increasingly hollow after everything she had witnessed over the winter. She sat in silence, offering polite responses, but her mind drifted to the kitchen house, to the smell of bread rising, to Deline's steady voice, to the rare but transformative sense of being truly seen. Deline, meanwhile, worked under heightened watch. The overseer had noticed Catherine's winter habit of lingering in the kitchen house, and though he was careful with his words, Deline sensed suspicion curling beneath his casual observations. She moved with even greater precision, mindful of how she spoke and how she carried herself. Every gesture had to be careful, measured for her safety, for Marcus's, and even for Catherine's. But beneath her composed exterior, she felt a tension she could not easily name. She had lived her entire life navigating danger, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional stakes she now held. Caring for Catherine was not a mistake she had planned to make. Affection, in her world, was a luxury that could cost too much. And yet, no matter how many times she reminded herself of the risks, she could not undo what had already grown between them. The first real fracture came in mid-March. Catherine had been helping in the kitchen when Thomas returned unexpectedly from a trip to the neighboring county. His entrance into the warm, busy room caused an immediate hush. Deline instinctively stepped back, lowering her eyes, while Catherine stood frozen, a mixing spoon still in her hand. Thomas did not yell, nor did his expression reveal anger, but something in his gaze, a brief, sharp flash of disapproval, left Catherine shaken. He told her gently, almost kindly, that the kitchen was no place for a lady of the house, and took her arm to lead her back toward the main residence. The moment was small, outwardly insignificant, but Catherine felt the cold snap of boundaries slamming back into place. That night, for the first time in months, she cried herself to sleep, not because Thomas had scolded her, but because she had been forcibly reminded of the world she lived in and how little control she truly possessed. For Deline, the moment was far more frightening. Thomas's expression had been calm, but the overseer's eyes afterward were not. He watched her throughout the day with a pointed interest that made her skin tighten. She knew how quickly a situation could shift from a silent suspicion to an irreversible punishment. She warned Marcus that evening to stay quiet, keep his head down, and avoid unnecessary attention. She did not tell him why. Some dangers were too complex, too personal to share, and some truths were too painful to speak aloud. Despite the tension, Catherine returned a few days later, a hesitant knock on the kitchen door signaling her arrival. Deline looked up, heart catching between relief and fear. Catherine apologized softly, explaining how suffocated she felt in the main house, how much she needed somewhere that felt real. Deline listened, torn between the instinct to protect her and the growing ache of wanting to keep her close. Their conversation that day marked a subtle but profound shift. Catherine spoke more openly about her disillusionment with her marriage, with plantation life, with the roles society had assigned her. Deline, after a long silence, admitted she had begun to dread the thought of Catherine pulling away, even though that was the safer path for both of them. The admission hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. In that small kitchen house, with spring sunlight pouring through the window and shadows drifting across the packed earth floor, the truth of their bond became something neither could ignore. They were no longer cautiously curious about one another, they were entangled, and the world they lived in offered no safe place for such entanglement to exist. By late spring, Rosewood Hall had settled into its annual cycle of preparation for the coming harvest. The plantation buzzed with activity. Field hands repaired tools, overseers planned schedules, and the air carried the hum of long, hot days ahead. Yet within the main house, a different tension was taking shape, quieter, heavier, and far more perilous. Catherine had grown increasingly restless, moving through her duties with a distracted air that Thomas noticed but could not fully interpret. He attributed it to her delicate temperament, assuring himself that life in the country simply required adjustment. What he did not understand, what he could not imagine, was that his wife's unease had nothing to do with boredom or frailty, and everything to do with the quiet rebellion blooming inside her. Catherine's world had become divided into two contrasting realities. In the main house she played the role expected of her, gracious hostess, obedient wife, keeper of propriety. She poured tea, embroidered linens, held polite conversations with visiting neighbors, and smiled when she was supposed to. But beneath each smile lay a growing sense of suffocation. Every polite gesture reminded her of the constraints she was expected to accept without question. Every afternoon spent walking through well-polished halls emphasized the emptiness that echoed inside her. In the kitchen house, however, Catherine found something entirely different, a life that felt tangible, imperfect, human. The laughter of the young workers, the crackling of the stove, the rhythm of shared labor, it all felt more real than any tea service or drawing room conversation. And at the center of that reality was Deline, whose presence had become something Catherine sought with a longing she struggled to conceal even from herself. Deline felt the shift too, though she tried desperately to resist it. Each day Catherine arrived, often with a book or small basket of herbs as her excuse. Deline's heart tightened in equal parts anticipation and fear. She knew the dangerous path their connection was carving. Affection between a white mistress and an enslaved woman was not only socially forbidden but violently impossible within the structure of the world they lived in. Power imbalances were not abstract concepts here. They were daily realities enforced by law and the constant threat of punishment. For Deline, each moment of closeness carried the weight of consequences that might fall not only on her, but on those she cared about: her brother, the other kitchen workers, anyone the overseer might choose to make an example of. Yet the emotional bond between them deepened in ways neither could fully control. Catherine would sit near the hearth, reading softly while Deline worked, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to share an observation or a memory. Deline would laugh real laughter, not the careful, measured kind she used in front of the white family, and Catherine would feel warmth bloom inside her chest. There were days when their conversations drifted into quiet reflection, moments when their eyes held for too long, when a hand brushed a wrist, and neither pulled away immediately. These moments stitched them together with threads stronger than either intended. But danger was never far. The overseer's suspicion, though unspoken, lingered in the air like smoke. Marcus warned Deline that he had seen the overseer watching her with narrowed eyes. Deline's fear for her brother intensified. She knew how easily punishment could be inflicted on someone innocent to make a point. The weight of that fear kept her cautious, reminding her that affection, no matter how genuine, had no safe place in a world built on ownership and obedience. Meanwhile, Thomas's behavior began to shift in subtle but telling ways. He asked the house servants more questions about Catherine's daily routines, inquiring politely but persistently about where she spent her afternoons. He began appearing unexpectedly during work hours, offering genial smiles that never reached his eyes. His business trips grew slightly shorter, his presence at home more frequent. Catherine sensed this change before Deline did. Each time she caught Thomas watching her, she felt a chill of dread, though she could not be sure what he suspected or whether he suspected anything at all. The situation reached a quiet boiling point one late afternoon when Catherine arrived at the kitchen house looking pale and shaken. Deline brought her inside quickly, lowering her voice as she asked what had happened. Catherine explained that Thomas had questioned her directly about how she spent her time. He had spoken gently, even affectionately, but his words carried an undercurrent of warning she could not ignore. "A mistress," he said, "must be careful where she invests her attention. Appearances matter here." The sentence was delivered calmly, but it struck Catherine like a bolt of ice. Deline listened in silence, her heart thudding painfully. She understood the meaning clearly, not because Thomas had accused them of anything specific, but because he did not need to. In a world where hierarchy was everything, even the faintest hint of inappropriate proximity between mistress and slave could unleash consequences that spiraled far beyond control. For the rest of that week, Catherine stayed away, forced by fear to retreat into the polished confinement of the main house. Deline worked with quiet dread settling over her days, every sound making her flinch, every approaching footstep raising her pulse. The separation felt like a wound, one that neither could tend to openly, yet both felt deeply. And so, as the plantation moved toward the heart of spring, both women found themselves trapped in an emotional landscape as volatile as the world around them. Their bond had grown too strong to deny, yet the walls of Rosewood Hall, built on power, silence, and possession, pressed in with increasing force, threatening to crush the fragile humanity they had discovered in each other. The turning point arrived quietly, almost deceptively, as midsummer settled over Rosewood Hall. The heat pressed against every surface of the plantation, making tempers shorter and routines heavier. Days stretched long and airless, and even the nights offered little relief. Yet beneath this exhausting stillness, events began to move with a slow, ominous certainty, as though the world itself understood that something fragile had grown too daring to survive in the shadows. Catherine had spent weeks restricting her visits to the kitchen house, obeying the unspoken warning in Thomas's voice. She forced herself into the rhythms society demanded. She organized dinner parties, wrote letters to her family in Charleston, and attended church with a polite smile fixed on her face. To anyone observing her from the outside, she appeared appropriately composed, the image of a planter's wife settling into her role. But inside, she felt as though she were walking through water, every action slow, unnatural, and heavy with the strain of pretending. The absence of the kitchen house weighed on her more than she expected. She found herself listening for the distant sounds of cooking, the faint melody Deline sometimes hummed while she worked, the comforting clatter of pots that had once grounded her days. In the stillness of the main house, she felt the ache of loneliness return with renewed sharpness, now intensified by the memory of what companionship had felt like. She missed Deline with a kind of longing that startled her each time it surfaced, familiar yet unsettling, gentle yet powerful enough to hijack her thoughts at the smallest trigger. Meanwhile, Deline shouldered her fear in silence. She returned to the disciplined caution that had shaped her entire life, telling herself that distance was safer. She spoke very little, worked without pause, and avoided lingering too close to windows where someone might notice her looking toward the main house. But even as she protected herself, she could not stop remembering. Catherine's laughter, their late, winter conversations, the quiet moments near the hearth. These memories crept into her thoughts at night, unwelcome and yet impossible to banish. She knew she should hope the separation continued, that Catherine stayed away for both their sakes, but the human heart rarely obeys logic, especially when it has known even a small taste of recognition. The delicate balance shattered on a day that began as unremarkably as any other. A sudden summer storm rolled in just after midday, darkening the sky without warning. The kitchen house, always busy before supper, became frantic as workers rushed to finish chores before the rain turned paths to mud. Catherine watched the storm from the upstairs window, feeling restless in a way she could no longer contain. The sky rumbled, wind whipped against the shutters, and before she realized what she was doing, she found herself walking toward the kitchen house, skirts gathering dust, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. When she stepped into the doorway, soaked from the sudden rainfall, Deline froze. The room went silent around them, workers instinctively sensing the tension, the impossibility of the moment. Catherine's voice trembled as she asked Deline if they could speak alone. Deline hesitated just long enough for the danger to register, then nodded and led her to the small pantry where herbs and preserves were stored. The storm outside roared against the walls, muffling their voices. Catherine didn't speak at first. Her breath shook, her hands trembling as she tried to gather words heavy with weeks of fear and longing. She told Deline how deeply she missed her, how suffocating the main house had become, how empty everything felt without the warmth of their conversations. Deline listened, her own breath unsteady, torn between the need to remain guarded and the aching relief of finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. Their conversation was raw, honest, and deeply dangerous. Catherine admitted her fear of Thomas's growing suspicion, her dread of the overseer's watchful gaze, and yet, in the same breath, she confessed that staying away felt unbearable. Deline, after a long silence, confessed her deepest fear, that any connection between them could destroy not just her life, but the lives of those around her. She spoke of punishments she had witnessed, of families torn apart for far less, of the brutal consequences the system enforced with ruthless efficiency. The storm raged on, thunder shaking the small room, mirroring the turmoil inside them. In that tight space, surrounded by jars of preserved peaches and bundles of drying herbs, their vulnerability stood unguarded. Catherine reached out slowly, hesitantly, and Deline did not pull away. Their hands met, fingers entwining in a grip that neither wanted to break. It was not an act of defiance, nor an attempt to name what they felt. It was simply a moment of human truth in a world that denied them the right to it. But the moment ended abruptly when Marcus's urgent voice cut through the pantry door. The overseer was approaching. Catherine and Deline jumped apart, fear jolting them into action. Catherine slipped out through the back passage, heart pounding wildly, running through the rain toward the main house. Deline remained inside, forcing her breath to steady, her face to go neutral once more. By the time the overseer entered, she was slicing vegetables, expression calm, movements practiced, but both women knew something irreversible had happened. A line had been crossed, not in rebellion, not in confession, but in truth. And the world of Rosewood Hall was not built to tolerate truth. In the days that followed the storm, Rosewood Hall seemed to hold its breath. The plantation resumed its outward rhythm, workers moved in the fields, kitchen fires burned, and Thomas conducted business with his usual measured calm, yet beneath the surface an uneasy tension threaded through every hour. Catherine and Deline avoided one another out of necessity, each retreating into her own sphere of silence and fear, but the memory of that moment in the pantry lingered with a weight neither could outrun. It clung to them like humidity in the air, making even the simplest tasks feel charged with unspoken meaning. Catherine tried desperately to return to her expected routines. She sat through dinners with Thomas, nodded politely during conversations about crops and politics, and entertained visiting neighbors with practiced cordiality, but she no longer recognized the woman she was pretending to be. Her thoughts drifted constantly to the kitchen house, to Deline's steady hands and quiet strength, to the way her heart had steadied when their fingers intertwined in the safety of that dimly lit pantry. The memory was both comforting and devastating. It reminded her of the first genuine connection she had felt in years, while simultaneously reminding her of how impossible, how forbidden that connection truly was. At night, she lay awake replaying the overseer's footsteps, the sound of Marcus's warning, the fear in Deline's eyes. The truth of what they were risking settled heavily on her. She was a white mistress, protected by marriage, wealth, and law. Deline had none of those protections. The slightest misstep could bring punishment far beyond Catherine's ability to prevent. This realization gnawed at her, making her feel helpless within the very privileges she was raised to uphold. She wanted to protect Deline, to shield her from danger, but she had begun to understand that the world she lived in was built to ensure she could never truly do so. The system benefited women like her and crushed women like Deline. Deline, meanwhile, faced a different kind of torment. She worked with disciplined focus, moving through the kitchen with the precise efficiency she had learned long ago was essential to survival. But internally, she was tightly wound, her nerves frayed by fear and longing. Every time a shadow crossed the doorway, her pulse quickened. Every time she heard the overseer's voice, her stomach tightened. She knew the pantry moment had changed everything. She had crossed a boundary that enslaved people were never permitted to cross, one that could not be explained away or undone. Even though nothing outright forbidden had happened, the truth was that intentions, even unspoken ones, could be enough to justify suspicion. And suspicion, she knew, was all the overseer needed. Marcus noticed the shift too. He asked her, quietly but urgently, whether something had happened she wasn't telling him. Deline brushed him off with a practiced smile, but her younger brother was not fooled. He had grown up studying the slightest changes in tone, expression, and posture to keep himself safe. He saw her tension, the quiet tremble in her hands, the way she avoided looking toward the main house. His worry intensified, and though he didn't know what danger lurked, he sensed it drawing near. One afternoon, as the sun baked the yard between the main house and the kitchen house, Catherine ventured outside to take a walk. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as she debated whether to approach the kitchen. She longed to see Deline, to speak to her, to reassure her, or perhaps to reassure herself, but the risk felt too great. She turned instead toward the orchard behind the house, seeking solitude beneath the shade of the peach trees. The branches hung heavy with fruit, the air thick with sweetness, but Catherine felt none of the season's comfort. She pressed her hand against the rough trunk of a tree, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer she was not sure how to shape. What was she praying for? Safety, courage, forgiveness, perhaps all three. While Catherine walked alone in the orchard, the overseer approached the kitchen house. He pretended to check supplies, his voice too casual, his smile too thin. Deline stiffened instantly. He asked her where Catherine had been spending her time lately, saying he'd noticed the mistress wandering about more than usual. His tone carried the dangerous softness of a man who already suspected something, and merely wanted to hear how much the accused would admit. Deline answered with the only truth she could safely offer: she did not know. Catherine's movements were the mistress's business, not hers. The overseer narrowed his eyes, lingered a moment too long, and left without another word, but the silent threat had been delivered. That night, Deline lay awake in her narrow bed in the quarters behind the kitchen house, staring at the ceiling beams. She thought of her mother's warnings, the stories whispered by older women about the consequences of stepping beyond the boundaries set by white households. She thought of Catherine, of her soft voice, her trembling hands, her earnest longing. And she thought of the world that could punish Deline brutally for feelings Catherine was allowed to have without consequence. The irony cut deep. Catherine could desire Deline in secret and still remain safe. Deline could simply care for Catherine and lose everything. As the days passed, the distance between them grew unbearable. Brief glances across the yard, accidental meetings in the hall, the flicker of recognition they forced themselves to hide, all of it weighed heavily on them both. Their absence from each other's presence became its own form of grief, one that settled into their bones. It was only a matter of time before something or someone forced a reckoning. Because tension like theirs could not remain unspoken forever. Not in a world built on silence, ownership, and fear. By late August, the pressure simmering beneath Rosewood Hall finally rose to a level neither Catherine nor Deline could ignore. The air hung thick with heat and suspicion, and every moment felt as though it was balanced precariously between what had already happened and what was about to. Catherine found herself moving through her days in a state of constant vigilance. Each glance from Thomas, each question phrased with deceptive gentleness, each lingering look from the overseer chipped away at her composure. She had always known her marriage lacked warmth, but she had never before recognized the subtle mechanisms of control embedded in every expectation placed upon her. Thomas was not cruel, but he was observant. He noticed Catherine's restlessness at dinner, the faltering calm in her posture, the way she seemed to listen for noises outside the house more than she listened to him. He noticed the unease, even if he did not yet understand its cause. His attempts to draw her back into the routines of her role, inviting neighbors, planning social gatherings, discussing future repairs to the house, only made her feel more trapped. Every gesture was a reminder that he believed he was the center of her world. But Catherine's world had already shifted quietly and irrevocably towards someone he would never consider. Deline felt the escalating tension too, but her understanding was sharper, honed by years of survival in a world where power dictated every breath. The overseer had grown watchful, his questions more pointed, his presence more intrusive. She sensed a tightening circle around her, a dangerous curiosity that could ignite into punishment with little provocation. She became hyper, aware of every movement, every word, even the way she breathed when certain footsteps approached. For her, danger was not abstract, it was a living thing crawling just beneath the surface of her days. One evening, the fragile balance broke. It began with a simple, unplanned crossing of paths. Catherine had stepped out to collect her embroidery hoop from the veranda, thinking Thomas occupied in his study and the overseer making his rounds by the fields. Deline was carrying a basket of folded linens to the house. When they met at the foot of the steps, their exchange lasted no more than a heartbeat, a soft greeting, a fleeting glance, a quiet observation that the evening breeze finally brought some relief from the heat. But the tenderness in their voices, the familiarity in their eyes, was unmistakable to anyone who bothered to look closely, and someone was looking. Thomas stood at the upstairs window just out of view, watching the brief encounter unfold. Though he could not hear their words, he recognized something in Catherine's posture, a softness he had not seen directed at him in years. His expression darkened, not with rage but with a cold, calculated understanding. He said nothing that night, but his silence carried a heaviness that followed Catherine through every room of the house. Deline felt it too. When she returned to the kitchen, her hands trembled. She tried to steady herself, but the fear she had been trying to keep at bay surged back with full force. She sensed that something essential had shifted, that an unseen line had been crossed not between her and Catherine, but between them and the watching world. The next day, Thomas surprised everyone by announcing he would personally supervise the afternoon work in the fields. This was something he rarely did. He usually delegated such tasks to the overseer. His sudden involvement sent a ripple of unease through the enslaved workers. Deline watched from a distance as Thomas walked with measured steps, pausing often to ask questions, studying each face with a quiet, assessing gaze. When his eyes passed over her, they did not linger, yet she felt their weight in her bones. Catherine sensed the change as well. Thomas's conversations became clipped. He asked fewer questions but watched her more closely, as though searching for something she did not know how to hide. At supper, she felt his gaze on her hands, her face, her gestures quiet, probing, dangerous. That night, Catherine crept to the sitting room long after everyone else had gone to bed, her mind racing. She knew Thomas suspected something, even if he didn't yet grasp the truth. She also knew that suspicion alone could devastate lives. The overseer didn't need proof. Thomas didn't need accusations. All it would take was a single decision, a single order, for Deline's safety to collapse. Across the yard, Deline sat on her narrow bed, legs drawn to her chest, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. She thought of Catherine, her voice, her words, her trembling hand in the pantry, and wondered how long they could endure the tightening noose around them. The world of Rosewood Hall was closing in, and both women understood that the next choice, whatever it was, would change everything. As September approached, the tension that had been slowly tightening around Rosewood Hall reached its breaking point. The air grew heavy with the smell of drying leaves, and the plantation buzzed with the restless energy of a season shifting. But beneath those natural changes, a more dangerous change had been unfolding, one that would reshape the fate of everyone involved. Thomas had grown increasingly suspicious. Though he had no clear evidence, he had observed enough fleeting glances, lingering silences, unexplained restlessness to convince himself that something about Catherine's behavior needed correcting. He was not a man who acted in anger. Rather, he acted with that quiet, unsettling decisiveness that comes from believing one's authority is absolute. And that is what made the danger so severe. The overseer, sensing Thomas's unease, intensified his surveillance of the enslaved workers. His eyes followed Deline with an unsettling precision. For days, Deline lived in a state of constant fear, every movement carefully measured, every breath quietly controlled. Marcus tried to stay near her whenever possible, muttering warnings under his breath, urging her to stay invisible. But invisibility is never truly possible when suspicion already has a target. One afternoon, when the sun burned low on the horizon, Thomas called Catherine into his study. The thick wooden door closed behind her with a soft thud that made her heart sink. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. Instead, he asked calm, pointed questions about how she spent her time, why she wandered near the kitchen house so often, why her demeanor had changed. Catherine answered carefully, her voice steady but her hands trembling at her sides. Then Thomas said the words that turned her blood cold. "I will not tolerate disorder in this household. Whatever is distracting you, I will remove it." He didn't mention Deline. He didn't need to. Catherine felt the message as clearly as a blade pressed against her throat. That night, unable to bear the weight of silence, Catherine slipped out of the main house and crossed the yard under the cloak of darkness. She found Deline behind the kitchen house, sitting on the step, her face illuminated by moonlight. Catherine's breath hitched as she approached. They spoke quietly, urgently. Catherine told her everything Thomas had implied, her voice breaking with fear. Deline listened, her jaw tightening as she absorbed the danger. She took Catherine's hands not in longing but in resolve. "Listen to me," Deline whispered. "Whatever happens now, you must not come back here again. Not at night, not in daylight, not even by accident. He will punish me, Catherine, not you, and I can survive that only if you stay away." Catherine shook her head, tears brimming. She wanted to argue, to promise protection she did not have the power to give. But Deline pressed her fingers gently against Catherine's lips to silence her. "You don't own the rules of this place," Deline said softly. "You didn't build them. You can't break them, not for me." For a long moment, they stayed like that, hands touching, hearts breaking, knowing the truth neither wanted to accept. The next day, everything changed. Thomas ordered the overseer to reassign Deline to field work for the remainder of the season, a punishment disguised as discipline. It was a harsh decision, stripping her from the kitchen she had mastered her entire life, but it was not as violent as it could have been. Thomas believed he was restoring order. He believed Catherine's attention would shift once the distraction was removed from her daily path. Catherine watched in silent horror as Deline was marched away from the kitchen house. Her shoulders squared, her face composed, her dignity unbroken even as her heart must have been shattering. Workers whispered among themselves, sensing a story they dared not speak aloud. That evening, Catherine locked herself in her room and cried until her body trembled. But Deline survived. She adapted. She worked in the fields with strength and discipline, refusing to give the overseer any excuse to escalate her punishment. Marcus stayed close to her whenever he could, offering what protection he was able. The community within the quarters rallied quietly around her, shielding her with the kind of solidarity only those who understand constant danger can provide. Catherine, meanwhile, continued performing her role in the main house with a hollowed heart. She moved through her duties with mechanical politeness, but every evening she looked out toward the fields, praying for Deline's safety in a world where her prayers held little power. And so, the story did not end with rebellion or escape, because the world of Rosewood Hall did not allow such endings easily. Instead, it ended with survival. Deline survived the season. She returned to kitchen work months later, changed but unbroken. Catherine remained trapped in a life she had never chosen, carrying the quiet ache of a bond she could never acknowledge. They saw each other from afar, a glance across the yard, a brief moment in the doorway, but they never spoke again the way they once had. Their connection became a silent memory, preserved in the hidden places of their hearts. The result of their story was not a triumphant victory nor a tragic death. It was something far more human, a fragile, painful survival inside a world that allowed them nothing more. It was an ending shaped by reality, not by desire. And yet, within that reality, they carried a truth no system could fully erase, that for a brief moment in the shadows of a brutal world, they found a piece of themselves in each other.